Part 1. I think people need to stop comparing every trading card game and collectible card product as though they all have the same foundation as Pokémon or Yu-Gi-Oh! In my opinion, Yu-Gi-Oh! Should arguably be the #1 trading card game, because it has something fundamentally different from almost every other major IP. The trading cards themselves are actually part of the anime. The characters physically own cards, build decks, collect rare cards, trade them, and duel with them. Therefore, when you own a real Yu-Gi-Oh! Card, there is a direct connection between the fictional world and the physical product in your hand. As a fan, you can genuinely recreate part of the experience you watched growing up. That gives Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards an iconic and nostalgic purpose that makes sense within the IP itself. Pokémon is different. Pokémon aren't represented as cards within the main fictional world. They're caught and stored in Pokéballs. Nobody is realistically going around collecting physical Pokéballs containing Pokémon, and that isn't what the modern collectible market is built around. Instead, the industry took the trading card format and applied Pokémon to it. Obviously, Pokémon became enormously successful, and I understand why. Pokémon are literally pocket monsters, creatures you collect, store, train, and battle. If somebody grew up playing the Pokémon games and remembers having their favorite Pokémon lined up in their collection or storage boxes, owning cards featuring those same Pokémon can recreate a similar psychological feeling. You can line up the Pokémon you love in a physical collection. So while Pokémon cards don't have the same direct in-universe justification as Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, the concept of collecting Pokémon still fits the fundamental identity of Pokémon. That's why I don't believe you can automatically take Pokémon's success and use it to justify every other IP being turned into trading cards. Part 2. Look at sports cards, for example. These are real human beings. If you're a football fan and admire a particular player, there are arguably far more natural pieces of memorabilia you could own. A signed football shirt, signed football, signed shorts, signed boots or trainers, match-worn equipment, and other objects that have a direct physical connection to that player and the sport. To me, putting a photograph of a real person onto cardboard and then convincing collectors that the cardboard should be extraordinarily valuable simply because of an artificial rarity is much harder to justify. I'd personally rather own an authentic signed or match-worn item connected directly to the athlete than effectively have a picture of the person sitting in my pocket or on my shelf as a card. The fact that the market has collectively accepted some of these valuations is crazy to me. I feel similarly about Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball is fundamentally about human-like characters fighting, training, transforming, and becoming stronger. If you love the artwork, you could buy an inexpensive poster and put Goku or Vegeta on your wall. If what inspires you is Goku's mentality, discipline, and strength, you can take that inspiration into the real world by training, going to the gym, and becoming stronger yourself. That's actually a positive real-world extension of what Dragon Ball represents. The fantasy isn't really about collecting Goku and Vegeta and carrying them around in your pocket. You're not watching Dragon Ball thinking, I wish I could collect these people as cards. You're watching these characters fight and potentially thinking, I want to become stronger like that. You're also not necessarily going to go out and buy an entire Goku or Namekian-style outfit just because you like Dragon Ball. So to me, attaching Dragon Ball to trading cards doesn't have the same natural connection that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has. A lot of these IPs are receiving trading card products simply because trading cards themselves have become fashionable again. It's a major collectible niche and hobby, so if people already love Dragon Ball, One Piece, or another major franchise, companies know that some of those fans will buy cards featuring those characters. But the existence of a strong fanbase doesn't automatically mean every card or every manufactured rarity deserves the price collectors are currently assigning to it. Part 3. That brings me to One Piece. One Piece cards are currently selling for significant amounts of money, and I think many people entering that market are relatively new to serious card collecting. Some may never have experienced what happens to a collectible card game across multiple product cycles. That's important because people are currently becoming obsessed with manga rares, manga artwork, red manga cards, and whatever the latest premium rarity happens to be. People can start treating today's biggest chase card as though it represents the permanent ceiling of the hobby. But we've already seen how this cycle can work. Look at Dragon Ball Supercards. Dragon Ball products were released for years, and manufacturers repeatedly introduced new rarities and new premium cards. Every time another level was created, attention shifted towards the newest thing. That can push previous rarities further down the hierarchy. The difficult part is that when you're actively collecting throughout that process, you often don't notice the transition happening. You're looking at the market every day, buying cards, watching prices, and participating in the hype. Then 1 or 2 years pass. 2 years might not sound particularly long, but an enormous amount can change in a collectible market during that period. Suddenly, there have been multiple additional sets, new designs, new chase cards, and entirely new rarity tiers. Collectors naturally start chasing the latest product because the market constantly wants another level. Part 4. The easiest comparison is an iPhone. Imagine spending £2,000 on the best iPhone available today. At that moment, it's the flagship model. Everybody wants it, it's technologically impressive, and you feel like you've bought the best version available. But Apple doesn't stop producing iPhones. 5 or 10 years later, several generations have been released after yours. The phone that cost £2,000 may eventually be worth £200 or less. The product didn't necessarily become useless overnight. The hierarchy moved above it. Trading card rarities can experience the same problem. A company can sell you today's ultimate rarity, but if it wants the game and collecting ecosystem to continue for another 10 years, it needs to keep giving people something new to chase. Eventually there can be another rarity, another treatment, another foil pattern, another artwork, another tournament card, and another level above what previously seemed unbeatable. Hype can add enormous premiums to collectibles. Remove the hype and you're forced to ask what the underlying object and its scarcity are genuinely worth. And fundamentally, these are pieces of cardboard. If a genuine catastrophe happened, war, displacement, or a situation where somebody urgently needed money to protect or relocate their family, you cannot automatically assume that an expensive trading card will immediately provide the liquidity you need. You cannot eat a card. You cannot assume somebody will exchange a house for it. You still require another collector willing and financially able to pay your asking price. That's why I think people need to separate market price from intrinsic utility and liquidity. Part 5. Population reports also need to be understood properly. People see population 20, population 50, pop 100 inches, or pop 200 inches on a grading company's population report, and sometimes behave as though that number represents the complete number of cards existing in the world. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It tells you how many examples that grading company has graded at that grade or within its reporting system. It doesn't automatically tell you how many raw copies exist. Imagine a card that collectors believe is extremely scarce. There might be 20 publicly known or graded copies, while somebody privately owns another 10 raw copies. That person doesn't have to grade all 10 immediately. They could keep those cards hidden for 5 years while the market develops, then gradually grade and sell them. Suddenly, the supply available to collectors is different from what people psychologically assumed when they were staring at a population report. That doesn't mean this is happening with every card, but the possibility of ungraded supply is something collectors should account for. The exception is a genuinely documented distribution where, for example, only 10 copies were officially awarded, and there is credible evidence establishing that supply. A legitimate championship or tournament card given only to a tiny number of identifiable winners can therefore be very different from an ordinary chase card, whose total raw population isn't completely transparent. Even then, provenance, authenticity, and distribution practices matter, including the possibility collectors worry about with unofficial or backdoor supply. Part 6. This is exactly why, for modern cards, I believe serialization is one of the strongest forms of scarcity. If a card is officially numbered 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, and so on, there is an explicit supply structure attached to the individual card. You aren't simply relying on a pull rate, PSA population, or assumption that very few copies exist. Each legitimate card has a numbered identity within a declared print run. That makes undisclosed additional copies much harder to introduce without creating obvious questions about numbering and authenticity. So if my objective were to make a modern trading card collection as resistant as possible to rarity inflation, hidden raw populations, and manufacturers continuously introducing new chase tiers, I would prioritize genuinely limited, officially serialized cards. If you're opening booster boxes and chasing the highest rarity available, my argument is simple. However incredible that card looks, remember that the manufacturer can potentially create something above it later. You might have a beautiful GDR Gogeta today. You might have an incredible one-piece manga Luffy. They might currently be among the most desirable cards in their respective products. But that doesn't prevent the company from creating another premium tier tomorrow. And eventually, if the company introduces extremely limited serialized versions of major characters, the hierarchy can change dramatically. That's why I wouldn't automatically assume that today's booster box grail is the final destination. Part 7. One Piece has already introduced serialized cards, and look at the attention and prices some of them are attracting. There are serialized Luffy cards connected with flagship battle events that have reached extremely high asking prices and sales despite those events not necessarily carrying the same status as a true world championship. That alone demonstrates how strongly collectors can respond to documented serialization and scarcity. So ask yourself, if a serialized One Piece card can command tens of thousands because collectors understand exactly what the numbering represents, what happens long term when more collectors begin comparing those cards against ordinary booster box chase cards? That's why, personally, stacking large quantities of expensive non-serialized modern chase cards doesn't make as much sense to me as concentrating money into the genuinely scarce end of the market. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is another interesting example. After decades of artwork, rarities, reprints, and different card treatments, there are limits to how many times a company can simply make another foil pattern and tell collectors that it's the next level. Eventually, serialization becomes an obvious way to create another premium category. We've already seen serialized Yu-Gi-Oh! Releases, including Japanese examples attracting extremely high prices. That's particularly interesting because, historically, many comparable Japanese Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards can sell substantially below their English equivalents, sometimes dramatically lower depending on the specific card and market. Yet certain serialized Japanese cards have still attracted asking prices or transactions in the tens of thousands range. If similarly desirable English serialized versions become available, I would expect serious collector attention because English Yu-Gi-Oh! Already has a powerful premium market. Part 8. Then there's Pokémon. Pokémon has produced an enormous number of cards over decades, but it has historically not built its mainstream modern chase card structure around individually numbered serialization in the way some other card products have. If Pokémon ever seriously introduced ultra-limited, officially serialized chase cards, I believe it could change how collectors evaluate modern Pokémon. At that point, I could see the market increasingly separating into two major ideas: genuinely important vintage Pokémon and genuinely scarce modern serialized Pokémon. If somebody can own an officially numbered modern Charizard, Pikachu, or another iconic Pokémon with an extremely small documented print run, then many modern non-serialized cards currently commanding huge premiums could suddenly face a completely different benchmark. That's why I wouldn't assume modern Pokémon prices are untouchable forever simply because Pokémon itself is enormous. Dragon Ball and One Piece have another disadvantage when people compare them directly with Pokémon. They don't have the same trading card vintage history. Pokémon has decades of nostalgia behind its earliest cards. Adults can look at vintage Pokémon and remember owning, trading, or wanting those exact cards as children. That nostalgia cannot simply be manufactured today. Dragon Ball may be an older franchise and One Piece has existed for decades, but their current major modern trading card ecosystems don't have the same generational card history as Pokémon's original TCG era. Much of the expensive material people are discussing in Dragon Ball and One Piece is modern. Part 9. That's why Pokémon and Dragon Ball shouldn't automatically be compared from the same perspective. Pokémon has an additional collecting psychology built directly into the franchise. If you played the games as a child, you collected Pokémon. You caught them, stored them, and built a roster. So owning physical Pokémon cards featuring your favorite Pokémon can reproduce that collecting feeling. Dragon Ball works differently. You admire Goku because he's strong. You watch Vegeta train and fight. You might take inspiration from those characters and start training yourself. You don't naturally watch Dragon Ball and think that the core fantasy is collecting Goku, Vegeta, Frieza, and Piccolo as objects. The reason Dragon Ball cards work commercially is because people love Dragon Ball and people currently love trading cards. Combine those two things and obviously there will be demand, but strong demand today doesn't automatically make every modern Dragon Ball card financially safe forever. The same applies to One Piece. However, I'm not saying every Dragon Ball or One Piece card is destined to become worthless. Both franchises have enormous and passionate fan bases. Even if the overall trading card market declines significantly, I believe genuinely important, beautiful, historically relevant, and exceptionally scarce cards from those franchises could still retain demand, particularly officially serialized cards tied to iconic characters or significant events. Ultimately, a collectible survives because somebody else still wants it. Part 10. If Dragon Ball and One Piece fans continue being willing to spend serious money on premium collectibles, there will continue to be a market for their best cards. Grading companies also currently play a major role by giving collectors authentication, condition assessment, population data, and a standardized way of trading expensive cards. As long as that infrastructure remains trusted and collectors continue participating, I don't expect the entire market simply to disappear. But people still need to understand the difference between loving an IP, loving a card, and believing that card is a bulletproof investment. Those are three completely different things. My overall position is therefore straightforward. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has the strongest conceptual justification for physical trading cards because trading cards are literally part of its fictional universe. Pokémon also has a powerful collecting connection because collecting creatures is fundamental to the franchise, and it possesses genuine vintage card nostalgia. Dragon Ball, One Piece, sports, and many other products are different. They can still produce valuable collectibles, but their card markets rely much more heavily on fandom, manufactured scarcity, artwork, competition, grading, and collector demand. Part 11. And when it comes to modern cards specifically, I would be extremely careful about assuming that today's highest booster box rarity will remain tomorrow's ultimate rarity. Companies need new products, collectors want new chases, and rarity ceilings can keep moving. We've already watched that happen across card games. That's why, if I were putting serious money into modern trading cards and wanted to reduce as many supply risks as possible, I would rather own a truly scarce, authenticated, and officially serialized card than continually chase whatever non-serialized rarity happens to be fashionable that year. A manga rare can be replaced in collector's attention by another manga rare. AGDR can be followed by another rarity. Artwork can always become more elaborate. Foiling can always become more extravagant. Another chase can always be manufactured. But if an authentic card is officially 7/10, there cannot legitimately be an 11th card in that 10-card numbered run without somebody having serious questions to answer. For me, that's the distinction people need to understand. Hype creates prices, fandom creates demand, nostalgia creates emotional value, but genuine documented scarcity is what gives a modern collectible its strongest foundation. Even serialization isn't a guarantee of future value. The issuer, authenticity, character, provenance, condition, liquidity, and continued collector demand still matter. But if I'm choosing between manufactured rarity and verifiable scarcity, I'm choosing verifiable scarcity every time.